Hi and welcome to the Enterprise Excellence Network webinar series. Today we have Cheryl Jekiel and Professor Peter Hines. So today Cheryl will be speaking on Are You Missing the Value of Lean in HR? Just before we get to that, I'm just going to explain a bit about who we are at the Enterprise Excellence Network. So the Enterprise Excellence Network is founded by Professor Peter Hines and is for senior lean leaders in Europe. We commonly hold benchmarking events every quarter throughout the year at award-winning host sites, and the workshops are over 2 days with the topics very much driven by the members and led by Peter Hines. These webinars have really been created during this current climate as a way of opening up and connecting with the wider lean community. If you'd like to find out more about the Enterprise Excellence Network, you will find my contact details afterwards in the follow-up emails. So you can either email myself or visit our website, where you can also sign up for future webinars that we have there. So just before we get going, just a bit of functionality with the GoToWebinar. There is a 30-minute Q&A session at the end, so please feel free to ask questions using the questions tab. And also Cheryl's very much encouraging you to chat during the webinar. So you can use the chat functionality to do this, and Peter Hines will read these out to Cheryl. Okay, so now I'm going to hand over to Professor Peter Hines. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Emma. And welcome along to everyone. I see some regulars, a few of the members in the session. Chris, my co-author of the last book, is there, and I see Darren from the Waterford Institute as well. So, and a few other names I recognise. So I'm very pleased to welcome you. Well, it's this afternoon for me, but this morning for Cheryl. To a session really looking at much more the human side of lean, and particular lean HR. So Cheryl has very much been a pioneer of this area, and I once accused her of being an HR person, and so she rapidly said, "No, I'm an operations person that's coming to HR." And we've had several conversations about the importance of HR, and my own particular feeling is that because many of us have looked at lean or other improvements very much from a technical side, we have very much missed the people dimension, and there's a huge opportunity for the HR community to contribute, but it's difficult for them to contribute because many of them don't really understand what lean is. So I think what Cheryl's doing is very important, is to sort of drive that sort of lean into HR and unlock that capacity in the HR community to help with the whole lean effort across the whole organization. So Cheryl's also very proud author. I can hold up the first edition of her book, Lean HR, which is completely different from the second edition. I can only hold up the work in progress because I think the book actually came out a week ago. So Cheryl perhaps can hold up the real book. So I encourage you to buy a copy of her book, so Lean HR by Cheryl. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Cheryl. I might jump in during the session if there's any chat questions or so forth. If not, I'll come back for the Q&A towards the end. So over to you, Cheryl.
All right. So just to get us started, what I'm going to be talking about today is, are you missing the value of lean? And what I like to root the work of lean HR in is getting clear what it's not about. A lot of times when we're talking about this, people have been doing this for almost 30 years. The first thing they think that we might be talking about is how to improve the transactional part of HR, like how to lean down HR or improve it, make it a more efficient function. So while that's a very small component of what we're going to be talking about, it's really mostly, in my mind, a place to build skills, not necessarily at all where the value of lean HR resides. The other thing I found over many, many years, and it's partly what led me to devote my pretty much my entire career has been a blend of working in the field of continuous improvement in HR. And I have found repeatedly over and over on all continents, it has not changed anywhere, that a lot of times it's the reason why HR isn't involved is they may not be clear why, and it's not clear to the organization that they're needed, that it's necessary. In addition, and I find it interesting, a lot of times when people meet me and I talk to them about the work I do, they look at me as if I may not be aware that the HR function in many organizations is challenged with how it, a lot of them get buried in transactional work and may struggle to be as participative as they could be in the strategic efforts. But with that said, it's not that they're not able to add value. There's a lot of times certain steps in skill building and opportunities that need to be there for them to be able to do so. I myself, just to introduce myself a bit, I have, I'm running the Lean Leadership Center, but I only started that 5 years ago. Prior to that, I've worked in many corporations in different kinds of executive roles. I started off in HR, and then was fortunate I was able to work in operations and sales and marketing, and then I went on to R&D and quality, and then I was COO of a large bakery for 5 years. As soon as that company was sold, I went back to my work in HR, and over those years is when I first published my book. And then from there, I've devoted the rest of my career, and I don't plan to ever end, to this concept of how HR can actually advance and enable continuous improvement to levels I don't think can be achieved any other way. So that's what we'll be talking about today. So it's helpful for me as we get started to learn just a little bit about you. And so we just have a couple of quick polls that we're going to run to find out which functions you're in, and a little bit, there'll be a second one on which type of continuous improvement methodology that you're generally affiliated with. That's helpful to our discussion. So the first one is, go ahead.
Yeah, I've just launched that poll. What function best describes your current position? So if you'd please select from human resources, senior management, operations, lean continuous improvement, finance, or other. So they're just coming in now, Cheryl, for you.
Mm-hmm. And you'll let me know the results, right?
Yeah. Okay, so we have 5% human resources, 47% senior management and operations, 63% lean and continuous improvement, 0% finance, and 16% other.
Okay. Thank you for that. That's always really helpful to get a better sense. And then the second one is going to be asking you whether you're generally affiliated with generally lean or some of the other improvement type methodologies, Six Sigma, Agile, OpEx, or something else. But it lets me know whether your general orientation to this is from the field of lean or some other methodology. So you're going to run that one here.
Yeah, that's just being launched now. Okay, so we have 95% lean, 19% agile, 52% Six Sigma, 19% OPEX, and 10% other.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Very helpful. Okay, I think this has to come off for the, it's not advancing. There we go. So as we get started, I'm going to start with sharing a piece. One thing that's shifted since I worked in a normal executive role is I'm now able to do this work in multiple organizations, which has been speeding up the rate I'm getting a better sense of what works, where HR is at. I don't only work in that area, but it's tending, I'm really one of the only people that particularly focuses on helping the HR team become educated and skilled and help advance. And so I want to talk a minute about an organization that I've known many years of my life, much less have done some work with them. And when I first got closer to their organization, what I saw was they had been working at this for some time, and yet they weren't failing, but they weren't succeeding. I think it's interesting in our field, there's commonly, if I said to you what percentages of continuous improvement or lean transformations fail, many of you might give an answer like 70% or 80% or 90% or something like that. What we all might also agree is I don't know if the line is that clear that things succeed or fail. What I've generally seen happen in many organizations, not just ones I've worked with, but I have a large network of lean organizations that I'm in touch with on a regular basis, is there's some kind of sense of, I think of it as stuckness. They may not see it that way, but it's as if they're trying to get to one place, but so it doesn't quite shut all the way down, but it may not get where they're going either. You know, it does at times just completely fail, but in this organization, it had been doing continuous improvement for almost 20 years. And yet when I got up close to it, I saw things that aren't unusual, but this is what I would describe it as. You know, like they had rapid improvement events going on once a month. They had been doing those, and there were certain report outs going on. So, but when I went through the plant environment, it still looked like most people had their heads down doing their work. It was certainly very much leadership explaining what was going on. I didn't see a ton of engagement. They talked about wanting to have an empowered workforce, wanting the participation of the employees, but I didn't see a lot of evidence that it was prevalent in the environment. And what they talked about, they even had a very clear whole culture laid out that matched those values, matched that idea. Many of the leaders actively studied lean, studied what it took, but they still kept struggling. So interestingly, when they invited me in to just even visit them, they said, we think the issue's in the HR area. We think it's important that they better understand what we're trying to do so that they can be of help, which is not necessarily a very common place that people say, maybe that's really what it's going to take to get us there. But they had come to understand that the leadership, the more traditional, this is a 105-year-old organization, the traditional management was so well entrenched that it was really a much bigger challenge than most people really understand to change out that idea of leaders mostly directing activities and employees following direction and spending the bulk of their day doing specific kinds of tasks, whether that's in accounting or on the shop floor, that most work is defined as do your set of tasks. And continuous improvement was something they did, about 10% of the entire population was involved in lean at any one time. That left 90% not that involved and pretty much working life as normal. And that's where they had gotten stuck at. So this was just an example. So if any of you can just go in your chat box and put down, what do you see as how many organizations are achieving the organization or the success that they'd like to have in their improvement initiatives? So what's your personal experience with, percentage-wise, what's the rate of desired success that you've seen? Now, Peter, then you're going to tell me what, if anybody shares what their thought is on that.
Yeah, I will do that. People are putting in a different pane in the question. So Philip has 33%. Mark, who's the sort of global CI manager for a big company, 30% in his case.
So about 30% are getting where they want to go.
Gavin, who's in Pharmaceutical, a big group, 40%. Jim said, hello, Peter and Cheryl, but didn't give me the number. So, so I guess sort of 30–40% seems to be numbers coming through from some of the guys here.
So that leaves a lot of organizations still wanting to get farther and not sure how to do that. So we're going to be talking today about what some of the barriers are and how Lean HR helps overcome those barriers. Because from what I've seen and what I know to be true is I always think that the sky's the limit. There's really so much potential in this work to achieve great success. It's that it requires quite a transition in how people work in order to achieve it. So as we think about the barriers, you don't need to answer this in any particular way, but I'm just gonna ask some questions for your reflection. Do your improvement efforts focus on cost savings, or to what degree is that true, that the idea of Lean is about being able to reduce costs? The idea, I think, a lot of times links to this idea of remove waste. So if you remove wasted activities, wasted steps, wasted work, that it saves money. So this idea that that's what it's generally about. The other question I'd ask you to think about is how much of your Lean is about, when I mean an event, it may not mean a Kaizen event, but it would mean there's some specific types of activities is when we're doing improvement, and then the rest of the workflow is like somehow the standard fare. So how much is it seen as a discrete point in time that's when you're doing it? Another question to consider is, have your work roles changed to include improvement skills or improvement work? So if you were to look at the job descriptions, let's say, or how people understand their jobs, to what degree has that ever been revised to include Lean activities, problem solving, teamwork, other kinds of improvement activities as required skills and a required general, part of their workday? Many years ago, and I don't know how many, but you used to kept saying 10, by now it's probably 20. Many of us came to some point where we said, it's more than the method, it's more than the tools, it's got to be culture. We have to implement a culture. First of all, would you say that's true of your organization or organizations you've seen? And if so, exactly how is that defined? How is a Lean culture defined? Meaning, when you say that, how clear is everybody what we're really even talking about? And then the last question is, how has the role of leadership really changed? So if you think of, let's say, just for the sake of conversation, a manufacturing environment, and we look at general managers or plant managers and department managers, how has that shifted to any new concepts, or how much of is it still, it's fairly similar, it's just an environment focused on trying to do Lean. So those are some things to be thinking about. This leads me to what I've come to see as some common barriers that get in the way, is an over focus on cost savings, meaning the idea is the value of this is somehow going to be, we're going to reduce costs and that will be the value of the work. A lot of organizations know they want to make it cultural, but they have a hard time getting beyond the improvement events, like how to transition from either some specific people working on it or everyone getting involved, but at very specific times, like we did, 10 people got involved in a Kaizen event and everyone else again was doing their normal work. Another thing I've seen in many organizations, not all, there's certainly a percentage, but I would say most Lean organizations I've encountered have not changed the work roles. So they would still say work is generally the same. We just continue to try and bring Lean in. The Lean culture remains elusive. Most groups that I've worked with, I do workshops. I'm involved in the Association for Manufacturing Excellence as a volunteer, and I have been for many years. That's one place I've met a lot of Lean organizations, and they all tend to, if I've said, what specifically is the Lean culture you're looking to build in, it a lot of times remains a bit elusive exactly what they meant. So as they desire to put in a Lean culture, there's sometimes not a very strong clarity. There may be some people that are clear. It's certainly not clear to most people. Even the organization I had just mentioned, that was one, they had a very distinct culture. It was well defined. Everybody talked about it. But when you got up close, most people didn't really understand what it really meant, much less what behaviors or skills or work changes would be true based upon that defined culture. So that's one place I would give an example of a company, I think, giving it all they've got to say we have a clear, lean culture, and this is what it means, but having a hard time getting people to really understand it, much less fully implement it. So even sometimes if it were even defined on paper, that doesn't mean it's defined in a way that is actionable to people because they're clear about it. And then the last, but certainly not the least, many organizations, friends of mine, within my network, are still struggling with how to get the leadership dynamics to change. That the top-down, more, I wouldn't quite call it exactly command and control, but in a way it really is. That more directive style is so prevalent that it's very difficult to create an environment that is truly unleashing the capabilities of the people. And as the organization was mentioning, one thing I always noticed, the ownership and the higher leadership was very aware that there was a value in the people contributing more. It's not that they didn't understand, it was that the general population wasn't following that. Most people still understood this to be a cost-saving initiative. So in this
Can I just jump in on just a comment on that? I mean, I see all those comments, all those barriers, and Gavin has sort of jumped in and said, I guess there is cost-saving focus, but it depends on what the problem is to some degree. I mean, one thing that I find continually annoying is that, management say to the, to the workforce, we want you to take part in this lean effort. And everyone's sort of saying, but I've already got a day job. So you want me to do this on top of my normal job. And it's
Exactly.
not in the job description. And then you get skills charting, and sometimes nice skill charting on the visual management board, and all the skills are the day job. And there's no culture change jobs, skills, and there's no improvement skills, and etc. So all of the structures are saying this is on top of your day job, instead of saying a lot of the things that, for instance, HR could help with is actually saying, what's the competencies that we need in terms of culture change and behavior, and what's the courses that we're going to provide, and etc., etc. So, it's not creating the environment for to overcome some of these barriers. Anyway, I'm going to shut up and let you keep going.
No, first of all, I love whenever I'm around people that have a clearer understanding of what a lot of this is. I just happen to be, sometimes I wonder, why did this end up to be the area of focus for me? I actually got involved with TQM when I was in my late 20s. I worked in a company called Sweetheart Cup. They don't exist anymore. And we did a complete transformation. The company was just doing itself in, going bankrupt with how they were managing itself, just huge amounts of inventory waste of every shape, size, and kind. And I got involved in it, and I saw a complete transformation, but they did it through the changing how work was defined. This is literally, it came in at how work was defined, that 100% of the population went through a shift. So it's as if it was the way I learned it in the first place. It took 20 years for me to realize that was not the most common way it was done. And since then, I devoted the rest of my life to understanding this and doing everything I could to help advance this in the world, because when you see it really work, there's really, it's amazingly satisfying. So again, just to give you the highlight, the organization I'm talking to, and this is just to give you an example, was some people understand there's benefits beyond the savings, meaning when I'm talking about the savings, what I mean is, like if a process took you this much, like it takes this much raw materials, this much labor, and we somehow make it better, that taking that piece of savings to equate to the work is what I'm speaking about, doesn't really grasp what the work really produces in terms of savings. We're going to get to the ROI of lean in a little bit, and so that's an example of it. The Kaizens, the Gemba walks, most daily work hadn't changed, a very defined lean culture, but not well understood in traditional leadership behaviors. So as I came into this organization, and with most groups that I help advance what I call the lean HR movement. The focus of lean is to increase your team's ability to create value. So what that generally means, it's really optimizing, if you consider any workforce team, what's the greatest value they're capable of bringing. And so if we think about equipment, we generally can assess readily what that equipment's capable of. What can it deliver? What are its capabilities? When the engineering group assesses it, they get very clear what it does. The thing about people is there are these amazing skills and abilities like human judgment and teamwork and problem solving and the ability to comprehend situations, identify problems, solve problems, increase customer orientation. There's a lot they're capable of. A typical work environment leaves much of that on the side and focuses more on you need to be a forklift driver or a machine operator or a quality technician or an accounts payable person, meaning work tends to be defined in fairly limited terms. What I knew in my mid-20s is I could tell that defining work that way left a lot of wasted capability. I don't think there's anybody with us today that isn't aware of the 8th waste. It's not always in the 8th place, but the idea that one of the greatest wastes is of people's skills. I have, again, to me, this entire field of lean HR is the focus on that precise area. So the focus of lean HR is to increase your team's ability to create value. So the first way this is done is by focusing on optimizing people's contributions. Some of the work I have followed to a great degree is from the idea-driven organization. Ideas meaning to what degree are people's thoughts, ideas, suggestions harvested and implemented in a big way to completely alter the results. There's a study by Alan Robinson that talks about 80% of the financial value comes from the contributions of employee suggestions and ideas. And I remember when I first talked to him about in what degree was this like a suggestion program? It's like, it's nothing like a suggestion program. It means that there's a mechanism that as people can see things and come up with alternatives and solutions that they're able to implement those. So it's really turning it to, it's more driven by employees and team members instead of really leadership identifies problems and engages employees as they see it. As they see it. Number 2, lean HR then builds improvement skills into how work is defined. Most talent management systems have not been redesigned to then build those skills into it. Now, many of you, since I know we have very few HR people with us today, it's not that HR does that on its own, but it is there to help advise and partner and collaborate on how to make improvement mindsets and skills part of work every day, all day, how to completely build that in, especially in the area of even how leadership functions. There's an entire different skill set of how to work with people from a coaching perspective instead of a directive method. I've spent the last 5 years of my life in that particular area of work, and the more deeply I work in it, the more clear I am that that shift from traditional leadership to non-traditional to the more participative style is quite a big shift in skill sets. So this is getting clear from every single person in the environment what skills and mindsets are needed and how to get those built in. That's really next where you upgrade the work roles. One thing to think about, if in a traditional work environment, you said any given, let's say, work role, like a machine operator, is worth X dollars and is generally seen as this kind of a role. A lot of times, if there's an upgrade in the role, it might be they could work maybe more than one machine, or they have a more advanced technical level of ability. But once you create team members who are able to solve problems, maybe lead work teams, lead Kaizens, are skilled at being more of a coach than a traditional leader, those skills are quite valuable to the organization. They're also quite valuable in the open market. So in a fashion, it's not just that you're adding these dynamics into the work roles, you create an environment that has extremely highly valuable people. In the end, where this creates the most value, from my experience, these types of workplaces that optimize the value of each individual have less people but each person is more highly skilled, meaning they might be making 20% more than the average market rate, but they require significantly less people. Like we might all agree, it's not a matter of laying people off. It is a matter of making sure, let's say as you experience growth, that you don't need to necessarily hire as many people, or as we have natural a certain number of people that might leave every year, that not as many of those need to be replaced. But this is, I know very clearly, connects to being able to get more work done with fewer people in general over time. The next thing is getting really clear about what a lean culture means to identify. As Peter shared with us earlier, a lot of times there's discussion about it, there's ideas about it, but in a lot of these same organizations, I'll say who owns culture, and they'll point to the HR department, but they're pointing to culture as their organization defines culture like that's company specific, with the idea that the lean culture a lot of times is maybe somewhat built in, but much on the side, so it's not necessarily integrated. So the first step that lean HR addresses is to get clear what the culture really means in specific skills and mindsets, getting that clearly defined, and then having very clear initiatives that implement that on a pervasive scale until it's part of the everyday work life. So all of these things work together. It's just very important that this idea of how to be beyond the tools and become cultural, I always say, get the rubber to meet the road. It has to become very specific, concrete, and implementable. And number 5, and this is probably, again, what I've seen to be probably one of the most difficult of all the areas, is for lean HR to advance the necessary leadership changes. Again, in a lot of these organizations, HR is maybe lightly involved to not involved, and yet the place it most gets stuck at is leaders retaining their traditional style of mostly, the way I put it to people, if someone walks up to you and asks you, something's wrong on the production floor, we're getting product and it's not correct, what should I do? A typical, certainly supervisor or leader, oftentimes answers the questions, because that's your instinctive response, is to answer questions. That type of dynamic goes on every day, all day. Every day, all day. People, there's always opportunities to advance the skills of the people, but traditional leadership tends to own the problems, solve the problems. It's a big skill set shift and mindset shift to understand themselves as not the people that need to own the problems and solve the problems. Many leaders were ever promoted into the jobs they're in because they were good problem solvers, not necessarily the people the greatest at bringing up their teams. I've also seen in a common workplace, if you had, let's say, 100 supervisors, some of them, there's maybe 10 to 20% seem to just be naturally born this way. They aren't great developers of people. It's not that nobody is, but if you're trying to get 100 supervisors or managers to be able to support and inspire people to unleash all the gifts and talents in the workplace, that is a tremendous skill shift and mindset shift. In my mind, if HR is not involved in that, I don't see any way to accomplish that shift with, let's say, operations working somehow apart from HR, or the general organization working apart from HR. So this is the area I still see to be probably the greatest area of challenge to overcome, and it's really because it's a significant challenge. Shifting the way a leader thinks of themselves and how they operate is a really major shift. So the way I'm thinking of this and asking us to consider today, for every barrier, there's a way that lean HR helps overcome it. So if there's a strong focus on cost savings, it helps shift the view to understanding the greatest value, which I'll talk more about in a minute, is in people's contributions. How to build improvement skills into how work is defined, the need to upgrade work roles into the entire talent management system at an upgraded level, implementing lean cultures as defined skills and mindsets, and to advance the necessary leadership changes. So those are the ways that lean HR has a tremendous value to bring. So what is the level of involvement of your HR group in the continuous improvement or lean efforts?
Okay, I'm just going to launch that now. Oh.
We have a couple of questions. Do you want to take them now or at the end?
I would love that. I would just love that.
Okay, so question here from Jim. Perception is everything, as the saying goes. How much shift within HR/OD industry has to take place for the staff to view the HR function actually means more than stick and carrot of the top in the organization?
Give me the last part of that question one more time. It's a great question.
Okay, so so how much shift within the HR/OD industry has to take place for the staff to view the HR function actually means more than the stick carrot of the top of the organization?
Yeah, great question. I literally every day of my life seem to be in this precise area. It's one of the reasons why I've focused on it. I think it's fairly tremendous, and what I see in the groups when I'm up close is they have a hard time getting out of the that more transactional part of things, meaning when they even desire to become more strategic, they have a lot of barriers to that are difficult to overcome. So even organizations that are completely dedicated to helping this transition happen, they run into whether they experience it as time constraints. One of the places I talked about early on was lean HR is not about necessarily improving the transactional part. However, if we don't get that part leaned out and taken care of, that's one place they get stuck at. Another major shift that needs to happen is how HR people are developed and trained. From my experience, if they've only worked in HR, it is very difficult for them to have clear concepts of how sales operates or what drives customer satisfaction. They don't understand the marketplace that well. One of the things I've done in the last year, which I'd be happy to share with anybody who'd be interested that you could do internally, is how to build business acumen inside of the organization. So that's another major shift, is HR/OD needs to have as strong a business acumen as really the other functions. And even in operations, it doesn't mean that they can't improve from advancing business acumen. So that's, again, in any particular industry, how does my industry operate? What are the external trends, issues, threats to our environment we need to be aware of? Inside my organization, do I understand what each and every function does and how it works together? HR and OD become much more valuable that way. I would say the kind of training in the open market on building business acumen in HR, I think was not necessarily very helpful. I've become a fan of that needs to come from the inside the organization, meaning have the CEO, the head of sales, the head of marketing, the head of finance teach people inside what all those things mean inside that particular organization, and then help them make those connections. So I think the other place there's a lot of stuckness is without stronger business acumen, they have a hard time getting to where they need.
Just on that point, reflection I have many years ago when I did an MBA, and I was one of the executive course with part-time people. And we had about 60 of us. I don't think there was a single HR person. There were sales people, operations people, marketing people, etc. But I don't think there was anyone from HR. They saw their career as getting deep into HR rather than getting that wider general management knowledge. Anyway, Another question if we take this one just now, from Stephen. How do you start if there's 100+ leaders who might have to have this shift in mindset?
Well, what I've come up with a few years ago, it was almost just really by happen chance. I was doing some continuous improvement work in a state government environment that was putting in supervisory training. So I'm talking about, you probably have some familiarity with the kind of training we do, especially when people go from an operational role to becoming a supervisor. It's often was referred to as frontline supervisory skills. So it's the basics of how do you set expectations, how do you make sure people are trained, how do you give feedback, and how do you use positive reinforcement, these basic fundamental skills. I think I first learned how to deliver them and bring them into an environment literally 30 years ago. So as I watched them do it in this lean environment, I realized that they don't connect right, that this old-fashioned style of developing those skills. So if I had 100 supervisors, the first place I go to is to make sure you're shifting the very fundamental idea of how they work with people in general. what HR people are well aware of, most times when a person or a team comes to us and says, we're not getting what we want from the team, there's a set of questions that we always ask. Were the expectations clear? Was the person properly trained? What kind of feedback, support, mentoring have they been given? And again, is there a positive work environment for people to produce those results? So getting that built into the leadership culture, mostly using helping them learn how to use more questions and careful listening. Those skills, not only that breeds the kind of leadership style, there's no reason why it can't be done in a large group of 100, but it is a matter of shifting their very sense of every day, all day. Like not just how do I run a Kaizen event, this is how I need to work with people every day. Those are just basic core good people management skills, but from a lean perspective, a much heavier focus on a coaching style, like how to do that and create independent employees, not how to, that's where the use of asking questions more of the time, they start to see that they help create the problem by the way they leave people dependent. And by not using questions, a lot of times they haven't asked enough questions to know whether or not what the issues might be that are causing people not to follow their lead. From my point of view, in the end, if leaders got very good at these core skills I just mentioned, much of this advances forward. By the way, when we implemented it, no one was almost more surprised than me that it worked and that most of the leaders advanced. Most described a shift in having less pressure, less stress, and watching their groups advance as they became aware of how to make that happen. But it's got to be a very simple core skill that's clear to them that you're going to use it every day, all day. Literally every time your employee asks you a question, you're up to bat. Mm-hmm. Almost every time you're interacting with your teams, you're up to bat. It's every single time. So it's a continual everyday practice.
Okay, good. There's a thank you from both Jim and Stephen. So perhaps I'll let you get back to your poll now. So let's keep going.
Well, tell me, what is the current level of involvement of your HR group in the continuous improvement efforts?
Okay, I've just launched that poll, Cheryl.
Are you asking Stephen or Jim?
This is one of the poll questions that I've just launched for the audience.
Right, sorry. Okay.
So, yeah, what is the level of involvement of your HR group in the continuous improvement of lean efforts? So either not involved, slightly involved, very involved, or drive the improvement efforts. Okay, so 16% voted not involved, 74% slightly involved, 11% very involved, and 0% drives the improvement efforts.
Yeah, that's fairly common. That's very common to what I traditionally see. It's good. But by the time we end, I'm gonna give you some thoughts. If you decide you want to shift that, how you might go about doing that. I am aware I'm gonna wanna make sure we keep on time so that I get through everything that I can share, and I'll end with some resources for you that you can use. So here's one of the pieces in the last year I've gotten more clear that I'm working with groups to understand. This, if you were to think about what the value of this is, like what makes this so important? Why do we care? The first line on the bottom is showing you what a typical improvement implementation has some slight rise in improvement, and then a lot of times, I'm being kind, starts to come down. A lot of them can actually go back down to almost zero. They come up and they come down. In many organizations, best case, when they're able to get sustainable results and they're able to continue to get a continuous improvement flow over time, they certainly have a good gradual incline over time and have continually improving results. The premise of this work, by optimizing the value of people, is that they're literally, it's a significantly higher improvement value. By the fact, if HR has no understanding of what you're talking about, it doesn't help create that much more exponentially higher improvement value. And I'm going to talk next about what is the value lean HR can bring. At the end of this, and Peter, I don't know if you guys share these slides, this is just a free resource that is a 10-point outline of how to calculate the ROI of lean. In that, the closer you get to understanding, it's in the capability of the people, how to truly understand what the financial value of that really is. But here's a couple things to be thinking about in terms of the value of lean. In the field of engagement, many people are not clear. There is very distinct, many forms of research that show that a highly engaged workforce is more valuable than one that is not. And with my background, if you looked at what constitutes lean and what constitutes engagement, there is almost a complete overlap. So once you get a workforce completely engaged in problem solving and understanding the business and engaging their complete capability, what you do is increase engagement. One study I often refer to is it's anywhere between 7 and 11% profitability, certainly increased shareholder value. I have found every form of research I can find on this. They all point to the Gallup studies, have other kinds of financial criteria of how engagement drives huge value. What most people in the lean field are not clear that lean drives engagement, and that is one of its greatest actual financial values. Number two, it drives revenue. One of my early experiences is we were supplying straws when I worked for Sweetheart Cup to a major fast food chain, and there was a quality problem. After we had implemented this kind of a workforce, when that problem showed up, they had a team of their people work with a team from the actual operation to solve it. What they did next was reward the company with $40 million of the total straw revenue, all their straw business, because they wanted to do business with an organization with a completely engaged workforce. So one question to ask yourself, if you had this kind of a workforce, would you get more business if customers were aware that it was that type of a workplace that was producing it? Certainly improved quality and decreased operating costs. Now, where most people then get stuck on this topic is, how do I find the money? So how do I dollarize it or put it into some specific set of terms? Obviously, you don't work in dollars. How do I put specific numbers on it to calculate it? One way to think about it is just to use a 1% rule. It's not literally worth 1%. It's actually usually worth much more. But once you can get to a number using 1%, you start to give it perspective. So what is 1% profitability based upon the value of engagement? What is 1% profitability from a 1% increase in revenue? What is 1% of improved labor costs worth? What is 1% cost of quality worth? So again, from an HR, one of you had asked how to bring along HR. Many of them, they start to grow their skills when they start to have a working knowledge of these kinds of numbers. So they might say, we're going to do some things, improve engagement. Even if it increased it 1%, it's worth this much. Then people start to understand what to invest against that number. The problem with not estimating this is, as in general, people are under investing in lean. That's why they're not getting what they can get from it. So as I mentioned, there's a handout for that. Recap is most organizations aren't achieving the amount of success they could. There's 5 common barriers to that, which we covered. Lean HR helps overcome those barriers by focusing on the value people can contribute, and improvement drives increased engagement, revenue, quality, and decreased costs. I think time-wise, we can either do this poll or move to your questions. I want to go through the resources. Peter, want to?
Well, let's do the poll. People can be thinking about their questions and typing them in when they've put the poll question in, and we'll be ready for Q&A.
The poll has just been launched.
So the question here is, which of the following groups has expressed interest in HR becoming more skilled? So I'm trying to get a sense. Again, much of what HR does is they're still employed and directed by others. Partnership is between them and other functions. So I'm trying to get a sense of, are there people outside the HR function that would like to see them become more skilled and involved?
Okay, so we're just waiting for the final few to come in. So we have 28% human resources, 72% senior management or operations, 72% lean or continuous improvement, and 11% none of the above.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. So one of the questions that I want to speak to is, what if we either don't have HR or HR team isn't involved in the improvement efforts? Meaning, how can you advance that? After many years of being in this area, I don't want to quite call it a struggle, but it feels like one some days, is having HR groups connect to other HR groups. So one of the things that I'm committed to doing is providing as many avenues as I can for them to learn from each other, because they basically like speak the same language. And when they see HR groups of lean organizations that are farther along, it helps get them more clear, what could I be doing to be adding more value in our environment. So in terms of next steps you could consider is to review your own current level of success and where you see opportunity to raise the bar with how you're going about your lean improvement efforts. To consider, how is your HR department involved? What myths about lean HR are present in your organization? And consider how you might fall into the common barriers and consider ways to get out of them. Now, in terms of becoming part of the Lean HR movement, I refer to it, one, you can get that freebie. My content that comes out is not sales-based. I'm not trying to get people to work with me. I'm usually distributing different kinds of content from the work I do so that HR groups, I have probably 30 of them available already, or my book, to have people read it. I have ways that they can do book studies around it to just get them talking about it and engaging with it. It's not a matter of sit down on a Saturday afternoon and read it. It's got a lot of topics in there that HR groups, I've had a lot of them, that's where they start. They just read the book together and talk about what it means to them. You can contact me at any time for help or support. I do have Lean HR events during the year. Because of COVID, we've had to shift those to virtual, so we'll be having a virtual event later this year. But I'm always interested. This is not a financial issue for me. It's helping that community come together, I believe, is how this work is going to get stronger over time.
And if you go to, I guess, your website, you have a very good newsletter which you send out weekly, is it? Something, anyways, comes quite frequently, and there's a lot of good content in that. So I have to say, most of those I unsubscribe to fairly quickly, but not yours. So it's definitely worth getting hold of that.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Good.
So I'm just what I'm working on.
Okay, so we got a bit of time for a few questions. One that's not specifically for you, Joanne's dropped out a few times with IT issue. We are recording this session, so we'll post this session. If you go onto our website, you'll be able to click on it and go through. It'll be on YouTube. And also, Cheryl may well be posting it, I guess, on your website afterwards as well.
Right.
So
right.
You'll be able to have a look later. Okay, Philip says very good presentation, so we'll take that as a read. Richard, thank you for your time and insight, Cheryl, and to you, Peter, for facilitating and supporting well, both. Okay, any questions for Cheryl? Right, so one from Philip here. How could you get HR to get more engaged in Lean?
Well, that's a common question, as I said. Sometimes, again, if you said go buy the book, that's still too big a step. Again, I think it's them connecting that there is such a thing as a Lean HR community, that there are HR people in other organizations. Certainly, if many of you, let's say, are leaders in the operational area, it's certainly asking it of them, making it clear it's something you desire. I think some of you, by the way you asked the poll, there's an interest in it, but they don't know how to. Again, I want to be really clear. If you have any of your people, contact me. I'm only going to hook them up either with other companies or with things to help them read and learn more, to help get them more interested. One of the things that got me involved in this is someone in a conversation said it was a lean person said, I sat down for an hour and I explained to this HR person what this was about, and they just didn't get it. I'm like, well, that's because they don't know what you're talking about. I do know from living this, it really is, it's a gradual education. That's the reason why I'm saying, even if they just read a little, they go through some webinars, just find ways they can get more information. And the business acumen piece is something, again, they could run that. That's meant for you to bring into your organization, let them head that up. That can be another way they can get just a whole lot more involved and more ready to take this on. And as I said, happy to help in any way I could.
I think that's a key thing. It's also quite useful for people to network and to meet other HR professionals who have understood this and done something about it. And I have in mind one company that I've worked with for a while, and Lean sits in HR, and we've talked about this as being an unusual, not completely. And in their case, it's almost, how do we get operations involved? It's a very bizarre situation, but what they're doing is so much better than most lean efforts. And when you've got HR people doing Gemba walks so they can learn how to do a Gemba walk so they can teach the management, you're thinking, well, that's exactly the sort of thing that HR should be doing with their skills of facilitating and coaching, learning the technical tools to then be able to teach the hard and the soft side at the same time. Okay, we have a question here. Thank you from Philip. So Mark asked a question. So, hi Cheryl, over the last few years, I've managed to engage some star 10 site, maybe about 10 site GMs with lean culture, but I'm struggling with the senior managers, e.g. VPs. Any tips for that?
About how to get them to appreciate the lean culture?
Yeah, I guess he's got the senior person, but not the next tier in the organization.
Again, I think one, I would need to get closer to understand what's been attempted to engage them. But one of the reasons why I was focusing on seeing this potentially is mostly about cost savings is they're really not understanding the value of it. So a lot of times when I'm seeing either people aren't completely understanding or don't think it's all that valuable, they probably, first of all, underestimate the value of it and what it could really do, much less what it might mean to them. And I think the question, it sounds like that you said the senior management it's the next layer down that's not?
The sort of VP level, yeah.
Yeah. My other thing, the only other major thing I've seen change the game fairly quickly is to get whole teams go visit other highly engaged environments.
Sorry, Mark's saying the next layer up from
next layer up.
Yeah.
That's usually then a senior team to senior team visit is one thing I've just seen make overnight changes. So it's the reason why the lean community is so well networked. It's to make sure there's ways that that group can go meet their like type at another organization. And I've seen in the lean community, companies will go way out of their way to help another organization understand. So it really may mean finding the right place to bring them to let them visit an environment. Then once they see it for themselves, a lot of times that's what shifts it for them. So
sure,
I don't have a perfect answer, but I've seen it work many times.
I actually know Mark quite well, and yes, the visit we've been trying to arrange to the site in Northern England or other sites, you know, that's exactly the sort of thing that companies need to do. There's a question from Aidan, but he said we've answered it, so perhaps we'll move on to Gavin. Okay, so Gavin, if you don't have HR understanding lean and all the components, will this have a serious impact on who to hire? If they don't get lean, then how can they hire people aligned in the overall business goals? Example, hiring the correct personality and obviously behaviors and so forth at the starting place.
They, to my knowledge, they generally almost really can't. You could build their background on that more quickly than they would have their own lean skills. It's one reason to do lean, again, inside HR. If those same HR leaders did, let's say, a Kaizen event, and then when they went to do interviews, they'd have a more felt sense of what that means, or if they worked on their own coaching skills, then they would realize when they were interview candidates what they're looking for in someone that helps develop people in a different way. So to my knowledge, it's one of the reasons, the fact I don't think it's harmless that they're not involved. I think most people don't consider it that big a deal. Like, they're not necessarily involved, but why does it matter? And I'm like, that's a really good example of why it matters.
Yeah, I have to say I'm much drawn to the sort of Toyota approach in the way you've been talking. That, you know, I don't think I've met an HR professional in Toyota that hasn't been an operations professional previously. And when you talk to them and you look at their system of recruitment and induction, it's just all about behaviors and attitude. And they say skills, we can teach you skills. We can teach you how to do all, you know, all the make the car and all the lean tools. But if you don't have the right motivation and behavior and attitudes, it's not, you know, it's not going to work.
Yeah.
Okay. One more question.
I just want to add that, and I'll take a question.
Yeah.
The other thing is, get your HR people out visiting lean organizations. Don't worry about whether they go to the HR department. Get them out visiting. If they see it more, they will also start to absorb what's different in those work environments and what you're likely needing to hire to. So I also think for them doing even virtual work, I mean, there's all kinds of virtual tours, get them exposed to what these environments look like, and that'll help them learn too. I'm sorry, go ahead, Peter.
So I think Philip is sort of referring back to something you talked about earlier on. So in terms of competency matrix, having less people with more skills and better pay, so it's a sort of more for less type environment. Is that the philosophy? Is that what you're talking about, really?
It's certainly something, to me, when lean HR is in its more advanced place, that's what you're going to be heading towards. It isn't something I'd probably do in year one, but it is certainly, to me, when it peaks in its value, you have 100% of the entire team is advancing their skills, and you can certainly do more with less people. And the people, by the way, those workforces are slow to hire. They're not quick to want more people. The better they become, they will let you know whether they need more team members or they don't need more team members. They become they're frugal by nature.
Yeah, absolutely. Do we have any more questions? I'll just give you a minute in case there's any more coming through. I don't see any. Oh, yeah, we do. But maybe we'll take this as the last one. It's Philip again. He's obviously got very active today. What lean training do you recommend for employees?
Well,
we could probably have 3 hours on this one.
Yeah, right. Other than, here's what I have learned a long way. One, skills need to be built in small increments, and they have to be applied. So whatever training you're going to do, you need to be clear how the person is to apply it. A lot of organizations, let's say, put every single person through problem-solving training, but don't have a clear plan when to apply it. And even when we talked about supervisory skills, I found until they could learn to ask good open-ended questions at all, they can't begin to learn later and later and later skills. So one way I would think about it, it takes several years, but if any 1 year you work to get certain basic skills through, keep getting those in, reinforce it, make sure it's applied, and then add on to it. So a lot of it is really getting clear how people learn and make sure that what you're training on, you have a way to use it.
Sure, good. Okay, well, I think time's up. So I think we'll bring things to an end. So on your behalf, I'd like to thank Cheryl for the presentation and the thought-provoking ideas that were in there. So in the presentation, there were links, etc., that you can have a look at. We will be, as I say, posting this presentation, so you'll be able to look at those in more detail later. And yeah, so thank you very much, Cheryl. I think Emma's just launching a last poll for you.
Yes, thank you very much, Cheryl. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Cheryl, for a great presentation. So I've just put a poll. If you can please rate the webinar, we really do appreciate any feedback. And as Peter mentioned, the webinar video will be uploaded onto our website if you missed any of it by tomorrow. And yes, thank you all for attending.
All right, thank you so much. I so enjoyed being here. Thank you so much.
Great.
Thanks, Cheryl.